Hello and welcome to the pre-concert talk for A Greeting from Denmark. Now, this concert airs January 21st at the usual time, 7:30 p.m. And I'm your usual host, Robert Fraser. As you can probably guess from the title of this concert, A Greeting from Denmark, our music director Christian Kluxen will have a lot to say about this program. I'm counting on him giving the introduction to this concert when it airs. And I believe you will also be including an interview with members or a member of the Danish string quartet as an intermission feature. So I look forward to those two things. Now, this program has two suites for string orchestra. The Nordic Suite by the Danish violinist Rune Sørensen, and the suite for string orchestra opus 1, sometimes called the Little Suite, by the Danish composer Carl Nielsen. So first of all, what exactly is a suite and how is it different from a sonata or a concerto or a symphony? This is just a little bit of music appreciation 101 here. A lot of you will know this already, but in case you didn't, I'll just go over them really quickly. The sonata, the concerto, and the symphony, those three things, they're all related forms. Now, sonatas and concertos, or concerti, we sometimes use the Italian form of the plural. You can do that if you want to sound pretentious. Sonatas and concerti are pieces for solo instruments. Now, it's generally safe to say that sonata is for a solo instrument or an instrument with keyboard accompaniment, whereas a concerto usually has a full accompaniment, like a full orchestral accompaniment, with more than, say, 4 or 5 musicians. Now, these terms are fairly loose, of course. Concerti can be for more than one instrument. In fact, right now, as I'm recording this, my colleagues are working on the Beethoven Triple Concerto, which is, of course, for 3 instruments. And, of course, a few composers have written concertos for orchestra. Those are just pieces that feature nobody in particular and everybody in the orchestra. Bartók's is the most famous one of those. Now, the word sonata also, it's not just a type of composition, but it refers to the actual form of the composition. And I've talked about that a lot in my talks, the sonata form. It refers to how the piece is structured. It's usually a first movement form with 2 themes. They're presented, they're developed, and repeated, right? Now, a symphony is simply a piece that uses that same structure, but for a large group of instruments without a featured soloist, right? But a suite, now that's a different and thankfully much simpler and less complicated matter. A suite is usually a group of pieces that's played as a set. Like you have a set of furniture in a room is called a suite. Now, often it's a group of pieces written around dance forms. That's particularly important for this program. Now, for example, in the Baroque era, suites usually had pieces written in the characteristic style of certain dances. So you see movement titles like Gavotte, Sarabande, Allemande, Courant or Courante, or my favorite, the Jig. The jig, by the way, this is the one where we get the name for the Celtic dance, the jig, from. It's also the source of the musician's word for a job, what we call a gig.
When you're a musician, a job is called a gig.
Now, when they talk about the gig economy nowadays, remember that musicians invented that. Now, a suite doesn't have to be dance music, although it can be a group of descriptive pieces or just separately numbered pieces that don't have any outside references. So that's basically what a suite is. The Nordic Suite is an arrangement of folk music. Now, I'm going to say mostly from Denmark, but it includes some lovely tunes from the Faroe Islands, which is a Danish territory. It's located about 400 kilometers due north of the Outer Hebrides. Those are those islands just west of Scotland. So it's about halfway between Iceland to the west and Norway to the east. Now, if you're a regular symphony concert goer, you might remember we performed a piece of Carl Nielsen's called An Imaginary Trip to the Faroe Islands, and I showed you imagery like this. So be sure, after you've watched this, to do an image search of the Faroe Islands. You will definitely want to travel there when the pandemic is over. Look at some of this scenery. Now, the Nordic Suite was originally arranged and performed by the Danish string quartet, just 4 musicians, and at Christian's request, the Victoria Symphony commissioned their first violinist, Rune Sorensen, to arrange the movements for an expanded string orchestra. He even included an oboe solo in the 4th movement. So our principal oboe, Mike Byrne, makes a cameo appearance. The Victoria Symphony was the first group to perform this suite in November of 2019. That seems like an eternity ago, doesn't it? It has 5 movements, and they're given titles similar to the movements that you'd see in a symphony. There's an overture, a scherzo, a hymn, a minuet, and a finale. Now, each of these movements is based around one or more pieces of folk music. The overture is subtitled Ye Honest Bridal Couple, and it's an arrangement of a wedding dance from the Faroe Islands. The second movement this heading is scherzo, but it's actually a very lively jig. Remember I explained where the word jig comes from? It's a jig called stedalil. I hope I pronounced that right. My Danish is terrible. This is also a Faroese folk melody. The third movement, hymn tune, is based on a tune called Now Found is the Fairest of Roses. The fourth movement is a minuet, which is a dance very similar to a waltz in 3/4. And it's from an early collection of Danish folk music that was put together in the 1700s by a traditional fiddler and a dance master named Rasmus Storm. And the finale is a tune called The Dromer, which shows the very strong connection that Denmark and the Scandinavian countries have to Scotland. In fact, you'll hear a quote of a very famous Scottish tune in this movement, which I won't reveal to you now, spoiler alert. It's a not so subtle hint that it's a completely appropriate tune for the exact week in which this concert is being shown. So I'll leave that little mystery for you to unlock. Now, the thing that I love about this suite, and I enjoyed it very much when it was first performed by the Victoria Symphony, is that Sorensen has captured all the essence of these folk tunes. They're unpretentious, they're raw, they're just plain fun. But at the same time, he's given them this beautiful dressing, as it were, with really rich chords and a very sumptuous, modern sound to some of them. However, those two approaches really work well together. The folk music isn't spoiled by the arrangement. Sometimes when you arrange folk music for a classical music ensemble, it gets kind of over-polished. And the other thing is my colleagues aren't afraid to approach these tunes in the way a folk musician would. So they maybe are a little more careful about how they use their vibrato. There's maybe a little bit of swagger to the sound. The rhythm isn't quite so stiff an approach that you would take in a stricter form. Now, if you're interested in previewing this, you can find the original string quartet version of most of these pieces online. If you search for the Danish string quartet, add the words folk song to your search and you'll hear some lovely playing. Now, the other suite on this program is one of the earliest compositions of Carl Nielsen. In fact, it's his opus 1. It was written when he was still a student. He was only 22 years old, and he was actually playing in the orchestra that premiered it. They actually made him walk out from the back of the second violins and take several bows. Nielsen was and is very much the national composer of Denmark. He's certainly one of the most celebrated from that country. He's often compared to what Grieg was to Norway and Sibelius was to Finland. Now, I remember having Christian take part in one of my pre-concert talks when we performed the 4th Symphony of Nielsen's, and he said that Nielsen wasn't just a composer of so-called serious or classical music, and I'm going to put those in air quotes. He wrote songs for children. He wrote hymns and psalm settings for the church. So to call him a composer for the people wouldn't be off the mark. Now, there are 3 movements in this piece, in this suite: a prelude, an intermezzo, and a finale. And although they're not folk music in the same way that the movements of the Nordic Suite are, parts of them, well, especially the second movement, which is very much like a minuet / waltz, they have at least some of that element to them. They're maybe not music of the people, but they are certainly music for the people, and I'm sure you will enjoy them very much. Again, thanks to all of you for supporting us during this season. I'm happy to report everyone in the orchestra is doing well, although we miss standing close to each other. I never thought I'd say that because we are usually too close to each other, especially in the orchestra pit. And we miss the social aspects of our work. We have to stay masked when we're not playing and stay as far away from each other as we can. Some of us, like the brass and wind sections, barely see each other. So we're missing that social aspect of our work. But we're grateful to be working, and we're grateful to be bringing you some interesting repertoire, some of which we normally wouldn't get to perform. And we get to show it to you in a way where you can see us and hear us a lot closer than you can, even with the best seat in the hall. So enjoy this concert and the many others coming up, and I'll see you very soon.